If you've been struggling to grow your chest for a while now, or you're not happy with your chest development, then it is because you have not been ticking these 3 boxes. Here is the chest growth checklist, the 3 things that you ultimately need to be doing if you want to grow a bigger, better and fuller chest. But before I do get into it, there are 2 important things that I want to firstly cover, which will kind of impact your ability to grow your chest. And the first one is genetics. Now, when I said it will impact your ability to grow your chest, it will definitely do so from a psychological standpoint. If you keep telling yourself that your chest genetics are terrible, and that is the reason why you've got a pretty poor chest, you will by default apply less effort to your chest training, you will be less motivated when it comes to your chest training, and you will just settle for what you've currently got. Meaning you won't strive for progressions and improvements in the same way you otherwise would for a muscle that you believe has good genetics or good potential for growth. Here's the thing about genetics. They will absolutely impact the way that your muscle looks, especially from an insertion standpoint.
Now, insertions basically refer to where our muscle attaches, and being genetic, this is obviously totally out of our control, yet it impacts how our muscle is shaped and how it looks. So unfortunately, if you do have poor genetics from an insertion standpoint, you will be able to do very little about it, and therefore your muscles may not be shaped in the best way and therefore may not appear as big or full even when filled out.
In short, yes, genetics will impact how your chest looks and possibly your ability to grow it, but why does that matter? Because if you are doing these things properly anyway, you will no doubt be able to grow your chest, and therefore you in 2 years time of doing these things properly will be sitting here with a better chest than you now, and that's all that matters, right? Because that's all that you realistically have control over. So don't worry about what you can't control, worry about what you can control. If you've got poor genetics, so be it, but guess what? You still better try to grow a better chest. Now, that second thing that will impact your chest growth or your ability to grow any muscle group in general is obviously nutrition. Food is fuel. Kind of true, but kind of at the same time. Without getting too much into that, food is definitely much more than fuel. We ultimately need to enjoy our nutrition in order to sustain it long term. Humans, as a whole, get a lot of emotional enjoyment and mental impacts from the food they eat. But to put it simply, we do obviously need to ensure that we are eating to fuel our body properly if we want to grow any sort of muscle group on our body, but especially our chest. In the muscle gain conversation, when we are talking about fueling ourselves properly to gain muscle, we are mainly referring to 2 main things. Now again, this does not mean that there aren't other important factors here that may indirectly or just as directly impact muscle growth for some. These are just the main 2 things that for most will likely have the biggest impact. But again, these aren't the only 2 important things when it comes to fueling yourself properly, but those 2 things are carbohydrates and protein. You need to be fueling yourself with a sufficient amount of carbohydrates, ultimately preferably from quality sources, especially prior to training and especially prior to chest training if you want to maximize your output in that session, because carbohydrates are basically the body's preferred energy source for high intensity exercise. And protein, I'm sure you already know what protein is needed for, right? Muscle maintenance, muscle repair, muscle recovery. We simply need protein for protein synthesis to occur and therefore to actually grow muscle. Now for the good part, what are the 3 boxes? Well, I'll tell you, and then we can obviously visit them individually and expand on them more. Exercise selection, execution, progression. In no particular order of importance, these ultimately have the biggest impact on your ability to develop any sort of muscle group. And the vast majority of people likely disregard one or more of these variables. So let me tell you now, in order to get the absolute most of your chest growth, ultimately you need to make sure that all of these variables are the best they can be. They need to be polished and these boxes need to be ticked properly. Now, exercise selection, it's ultimately not that important for muscle growth. It won't make or break your gains, but it definitely will have some sort of impact. As far as the science goes, there isn't much on exercise selection having that much of an impact on growth. There is a little bit, which we'll talk about, of course, especially if you want to optimize muscle growth according to science. In general, do bear in mind sustainability, what you enjoy and therefore can apply adequate effort to over the long term is likely going to be a big individual factor in your exercise selection. Along with that, I would urge you to not place all of your eggs in one basket and only pick 1 or 2 exercises that science may say is optimal. We want to utilize a wide variety of different movements within our chest training if we want to optimize growth, because that way we can target different portions of the chest, we can work on different areas And along with that, we give ourselves variety, which ultimately can potentially help us sustain adherence to our chest growth program long term. So with that being said, in my opinion, we should ultimately utilize 3 different ranges of movements: a fly, some sort of flat or low incline press, and a machine press, possibly a high incline press, just so we can cover our bases. Now, to give you a bit of an example of how I structure my own training, I do a dumbbell fly. Now, the reason I do a dumbbell fly as my fly variant is simply because science tells us it's possibly one of the more beneficial flies that we could use, because it obviously loads that lengthened range, which we know is ultimately the most beneficial range for muscle growth because of the mechanisms behind stretch mediated hypertrophy. So if we could ultimately utilize movements that load the stretched or lengthened range, then we are likely going to see better returns. Along with that, a dumbbell fly not only loads that stretched and lengthened position, but it also drops off at the top. So by nature, it's almost like a lengthened partial, which has many studies on itself anyway. So a dumbbell fly is likely a very beneficial movement for chest hypertrophy according to the science. But the reason I do it is because it's very, very easy to get onto when the gym is busy. The dumbbells are usually always free. And along with that, it's easy to set up. It's pretty effortless to execute, and it feels absolutely amazing. And it allows you to obviously generate an amazing stretch. And obviously it loads that stretch. That's why I personally use a dumbbell fly, but you can use whatever feels best for you. And something like a seated cable fly is also a fantastic option, as it obviously has more tension throughout the whole range of motion, which again may or may not be beneficial. We could argue on that, but we'd probably be arguing over very minor points that will not make or break your gains. Now, secondly, some sort of flat or low incline press would obviously be a fantastic idea. I would probably go for something like a dumbbell press, just because again, it will load that lengthened to stretched range. It's very easy to get onto, and that means that it's sustainable within my chest growth program. And lastly, I would probably pick something like a high incline converging machine press. Now, do bear in mind, if you can, I would probably try to opt for machine-based movements, especially if they load that lengthened or stretched position, because these are obviously going to provide you with more stability and then allow you to take that target muscle to failure much more efficiently and much more safely. A dumbbell press is still a fantastic option, but obviously being a free weight movement probably will require some other stabilizing muscle groups to come into play, and therefore may not allow you to take that target muscle to failure as efficiently. But again, this won't make or break your gains. It's just a factor that's worthy of noting. Once we've ticked that box of exercise selection, next we actually need to tick the box of execution in order to make the most of our exercise selection. Now, in general, exercise execution is very, very simple. It's not easy, but it is very, very simple. And in general, there's not a lot of things for us to focus on here, but the things that we do want to focus on, we want to make sure that we are doing properly. So what are those things? Well, first off, your ability to obviously generate a nice full stretch. We know that range is very beneficial for hypertrophy. So on all of your movements, all of your chest movements, whether that's a fly or a press, you should be aiming to utilize the fullest possible stretch. That would mean maintaining a arch in your back, a depressed and retracted scapular positioning, and therefore maintaining a nice proud chest positioning, keeping that sternum angle high. This will obviously allow you to elicit the nicest, fullest possible stretch. Now, along with that, we need to make sure that we are controlling that eccentric range thoroughly, the best that we ultimately can. We don't need to be super slow, but we ultimately need to be controlling it. I'd say 1 to 3 seconds. Again, you don't have to slow it down a lot, especially if you don't like the way it feels, but I would urge you to try and spend probably a bit more time than you usually would in that eccentric portion, especially when getting that full stretch. You ultimately want to take your time through that more beneficial portion of the movement and utilize the fullest possible stretch, controlling the fullest possible stretch, maybe pausing in the stretch briefly again, and then obviously exploding, maintaining this sort of rep tempo throughout the set. If you could do that, you'd probably be covering your bases in terms of, you know, the most beneficial portion of the movement, and that's likely all you'd need to do to get the benefits from the lengthened range and stretch mediated hypertrophy. Now, along with our execution, rep standardization is important, and this kind of links on to the third box, which we'll get onto shortly. But rep standardization means that across your set, you're executing your reps in the same manner. Obviously, as you get closer to failure, your reps won't look as perfect, and that is totally fine. But as long as you can try to keep them as perfect, obviously not sacrificing the amount of stretch you get or not sacrificing the speed of your eccentric, that is likely all you need to do. Now, as for the squeeze and the full contraction, it's not really that important, but if you like the way it feels, and if it personally allows you to obviously apply better effort to the movement, then by all means go for it. I still lift with a full range of motion just because I like the way it feels, and I don't personally believe there is enough conclusive evidence to show that we should totally rule out full range of motion training. So as long as you are emphasizing that stretch, I would say still go for a full range of motion. And finally, the last box, progression. I'm sure we all know about this one, but how well are we all doing this? It's hard to tell, especially if you're not seeing the chest development that you want to be seeing. You see, as I've said with the past two boxes or variables or factors, whatever you want to call them, if we do not have one of them, it makes the other two or the other one likely not as effective, or pretty much in some cases quite useless. In this case, exercise selection and execution doesn't really matter if we cannot progress our movements. If we can progress our movements but our execution and our exercise selection is terrible, progression doesn't really matter, because is that really going to amount to that much muscle hypertrophy? Probably not, because remember, gaining strength is a specific goal, and that is why not all powerlifters are absolutely jacked and look like bodybuilders. So when it comes to progression, once we've got our exercise selection and exercise execution dialed in and standardized, as we touched on before, so it looks the same, we will ultimately be good to progress and try to increase our weight over time. But as I always say, little but better is usually better than more but worse, if that makes sense. So in other words, I would rather lift less weight with better execution instead of lifting a lot of weight with worse execution, because again, that is not going to correlate to better muscle growth. So do bear in mind, we do of course want to progressively overload and get stronger over time. We do want to progress all of our movements, but you should ultimately be very humble about your progression. For example, if you're bench pressing a lot of weight, let's say just for the sake of this example, like 200 kilos, right? If you're bench pressing 200 kilos and that is with pretty poor execution, you know, you're bouncing the bar off your chest, you will have a very hard time scaling and getting stronger from there, because your strength is already at a very high level and you're already doing everything you can to move that load. But realistically, you could definitely shave off a few plates of that bar, therefore use a lighter load but make much better use of that load through the quality of your execution. Because if you were to shave off 2 plates, go to 100 kilos for example, realistically with this example maybe 140, so 3 plates aside, right, you would definitely be able to get much better results from using that weight with much better control, much better execution, and trying to make that weight heavier, because then again you have more room to scale. You could work your way back up to 200 kilos with amazing execution, and then by that point you would no doubt see much more chest development. So again, try to get away with using the lightest load you possibly can, but making it feel as heavy as you possibly can through the quality of your execution, and that way you have more room to scale and more room to ultimately grow. Now with your progression, inevitably you will eventually hit a wall and have a hard time progressing, and that is where I would kind of recommend the biscuit approach. The biscuit approach is basically adding a small amount of weight, basically a biscuit, a 1.25 or a 2.5 kilo plate, and therefore trying to match reps with that biscuit added on. This is obviously going to allow you to have very small incremental progressions over time, and it will definitely be easier instead of adding reps. If you can do that long term, you are likely going to see more sustainable rates of progression, because it's hard to ultimately fail and not progress through such small incremental rates. And along with that, psychologically, it doesn't put a lot of pressure on you to progress. Let's say last week you deadlifted 200 kilos for 5, and this week you have to deadlift 200 and 2.5 kilos for 5. So you're literally adding a 1.25 kilo plate per side. That's really hardly anything. The bar still looks the same. All you have to do is match reps. If you tell yourself there's literally nothing else on the bar, you will likely not even know it's there, and therefore you'll easily match your reps. And just like that, you have legitimately got 2.5 kilos stronger. Next week you do the same. You add a small biscuit, and as you go through the weeks you add a small amount of incremental load, and just like that, from 200 kilos you've worked your way up to 210 kilos for the same amount of reps with standardized execution. Now if we were to obviously go back to that 200 kilos and try to add another rep to that 200 kilos, it would be much harder, because that is overall a bigger jump in progression. You are lifting more total load. So again, to ensure sustainability and genuine progression over the long term, try your best to obviously overload by incremental stages and matching reps, of course. So anyway, that is the checklist. If you can tick those 3 boxes, again, all of them preferably to a good level, you will no doubt see much more chest development. You will no doubt see bigger and better progressions in the chest department, and therefore you will ultimately have a better chest to show for it in the long term. Please make sure that you like, subscribe and comment, especially if you like the video. And if you want to find me on other social medias, then do so at davids.pt, www.trainbydave.com if you're in need of coaching or plans, or even some more information about what I do. And if you're in need of some free advice or help with your training, nutrition, or your lifestyle, or any aspect of your personal development, shoot me a DM on Instagram or on TikTok. Don't message me on TikTok. Who the uses TikTok to DM people? Anyway, that is me. I'm out. I'm waffling at this point. Make sure you like, subscribe. See you later.